And the second one is on the quantificational status of indefinites from the view of child language. So our main topics today will be the isomorphism effect and whether or not indefinites are quantifiable or not. Then we just wanted to clear up some terminology because the paper refers to isomorphic scope. The two papers refer to isomorphic scope, surface scope, and wide scope as the same thing. And non-isomorphic, inverse, and narrow scope is the same as well, just so there's no confusion about that. And yeah, that's, I guess, a very short introduction. And now Julia will introduce her papers and her experiments.
Okay. Can I jump in a second?
Yeah.
So I will try not to interrupt you, okay, many times, but there is something that we have to specify about the previous slides, if you can go back.
Sure.
So Annie, I don't know if you talked to Annie, she had the same problem and she sent me a couple of emails about this terminological confusion, okay? So you said that isomorphic scope, surface scope, and wide scope are the same thing, right? In this example, they are, right? But terminologically speaking, isomorphic and surface are the same thing, right? And wide is a different
different aspect of it.
Yes. So basically, I can also forward you the explanation of Mike that was very, very clear. The idea is that wide scope of something is always relative to something else, right?
Yeah. So
yeah. So
it's either the wide scope, the subject can have wide scope, or the object can have wide scope over something.
With respect to the subject. So
yeah.
Right. So wide means higher in the structure, and narrow means lower in the structure. Refer to a C-command relationship.
Yeah, that's right.
Am I right, Mike?
Yep, you are.
Awesome. So yeah. So in this case, just to make an example, the universal quantifier would have a wide scope because it's higher, right? Because it takes scope of everything else.
Yeah.
The second example, the negation is wider. Yeah. That.
Okay.
And it happens to be the case that, yeah. So just to make another example, if you take negation in the first example, negation has narrow scope with respect.
I'm so sorry, I'll be back in one second. I'm sorry.
Sure.
No problem. Okay,
yeah,
so I'll just go on with my presentation. So as we've already seen in the truth value judgment tests with the every horse didn't jump over the fence examples, children really tend to favor surface scope readings. And the question is why? And a couple of other questions arise from this. An important question is this a conceptual or a linguistic problem? So do children have like a conceptual problem with grasping the concept of these relations, or are they stuck in a linguistic process? The lexical problem that arises is, does it make a difference if we use universal or existential quantifiers? Do children have the same isomorphism effect? The pragmatic question is obviously, does the context play a role in the interpretation? The cross-linguistic problem, yeah, obviously, does this happen in other languages? And the surface structure or C-command question concerns exactly what it says, asking, is it a problem of surface structure that children see and take in, or is it a problem of C-command that children can access? So we're going to find that out. And the developmental question, to which I can already say I have no answer, is how do they finally converge into adulthood? Good. Noki, can you get the next? Yeah, thanks. So Lidz Musolino conducted a couple of experiments. The first one was to find out if children have a conceptual or a linguistic problem. And they took 20 native English speaking children between 3 and 6. And the theory was that if there is a conceptual problem, so children cannot wrap their head around the non-isomorphic relation, then there should be no facilitation whatsoever, no matter what you do. And they put the quantifiers in a different position. So they put a universal quantifier in the object position. The example is the Smurf didn't buy every orange. So yeah, the theory was that if the quantified expression is in the object position, it should facilitate the non-isomorphic interpretation for children if it is a linguistic problem, and if not, then it's a conceptual problem. And the result was there was no facilitation, so there's not a conceptual problem. Oh no, sorry, I'm sorry. Was no, it should be not here. Please ignore. So there was a facilitation, so children had an easier time interpreting the sentence when the quantifier was in the object position. So there was definitely a linguistic problem and not a conceptual one. Okay, next slide, please. The second experiment was trying to find out if this is
sorry.
Yeah.
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah.
So what did it mean that they found the facilitation?
So the children accepted the non-isomorphic interpretation of the puppet a lot more when they had the quantifier in the object position.
So right, the isomorphic, right.
Yeah.
So they accepted that not all.
Exactly.
Right. So
they accepted the not all interpretation a lot more than they would have with the quantifier in the subject position.
So the idea was that if they accept the not all interpretation in this configuration, it's not a problem about the not all interpretation, but it's the problem about, thank you.
It's a problem in the computing, sort of. Okay, the second experiment was trying to find out if this is the case as well with existential quantifiers instead of universal. And the sentence was Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza. And again, there was a truth value judgment test, and there were 2 conditions, the isomorphic one and the non-isomorphic one. In the isomorphic one, the Cookie Monster had 2 slices of pizza and only managed to eat 1. So the surface interpretation would be true, the isomorphic one. And in the non-isomorphic condition, they acted out the story so that there were 4 slices of pizza. The Cookie Monster only managed to eat 2, but there were 2 that the Cookie Monster didn't eat. So the non-isomorphic interpretation would be true. They had 24 children, 24 adults, and they were randomly assigned 2 groups. And the results were that adults accepted almost all statements, and children still preferred the isomorphic interpretation. Thus, we can conclude that there is an equal occurrence of isomorphism in existential and universal quantifiers. There is no real difference.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Can I just
Yeah.
make things clear? So, in this case, can you paraphrase again the isomorphic and non-isomorphic interpretation, because I'm a little bit slow every time.
That's okay. So in the isomorphic interpretation, the scene was acted out so that there were 2 slices of pizza and the Cookie Monster only managed to eat 1. So it was true that Cookie Monster didn't eat 2 slices of pizza on the surface scope. And the non-isomorphic interpretation was where there were 4 slices and Cookie Monster ate 2, but there were 2 that she didn't eat.
So the paraphrase would be, there are 2 slices of pizza that Cookie Monster didn't eat, right?
Exactly.
So there might be 1,000 of slices of pizza in the world, but there are 2 that he didn't eat, right?
So there was an existential, there was a not every, scope.
Okay. Whereas the other one was like, he didn't eat 2, he probably ate less, like 1, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the other one, there is a specific set of 2 slices of pizza and he did not eat them, he ate others.
Yeah, so in the first one, it would be not 2, and in the second one, it would be 2 not.
Right.
So, okay.
Thank you.
Next slide. The third experiment is quite important because they were trying to find out 2 things. The first thing was if it is a cross-linguistic phenomenon, isomorphism. So they tested in Kannada, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is the language of India with about 40 million speakers, so quite a big one. And they were also trying to find out if there is how the problem is structure-wise. So the negation in Kannada C commands the object but does not precede it. So as you can see in the syntax trees, what they were trying to find out is, do children only access the linear, the surface scope, the linear order, or do they access the C command? And the linear account of isomorphism would predict a wide scope. So it would predict that the analyst didn't read the books yet. So it would predict that whoever the MP didn't read the book, so the every not scope. And the Kannada C command structure would predict a narrow scope, so that there were 2 books that weren't read. And the results were that, oh, and also, by the way, the experiment structure was the exact same as before in English, just only with Kannada children now. And the results were that adults have no preference again, and children prefer the narrow scope reading. Thus, one could conclude that children access the C command, and that's why the isomorphism effect, what the isomorphism effect is based on. And also, it is a cross-linguistic problem, so also happens in other languages.
So basically in Kannada, right? I guess it's a left branching language, right?
Yeah.
So in Kannada, if you want to say what was it? The children didn't read 2 books, right? You literally would have to say 2 books. Read not children, or something like this, right?
I think it would be like children 2 books read not.
Right.
Yeah.
So you in the linear order, the numerals would occur first in linear order, but still in the structure would have a narrow scope, basically, right? And they found that actually children pay attention to the inner, to the deep structure, and not really to the surface order. That's exactly what they found, right? And they still prefer the isomorphic interpretation. Yeah.
So children can access C command order, and they interpret on the basis of C command and not linear order. That is, quite simply put, what they found out.
So they interpreted the sentences like 2 books read, children not, as the children didn't read 2 books with the surface order, basically, right?
Wait, no. So the interpretation that was favored by children was the wait. Now I'm confused. Children preferred a narrow scope reading of the object concerning the negation. Yeah.
Right. So it's as if they heard the sentence in English, basically. They didn't really care about the order of the words, but they cared about the structure.
The word order doesn't matter. The C command is what they interpret.
Okay. Yeah. And they still show the isomorphic preference, basically, right?
Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. The 4th experiment was quite an interesting one, where they tried to find out about pragmatics concerning morphism. And we probably all know that negation is better computed when preceded by an affirmative. For example, we have a sentence like, every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence. We can more easily interpret this as a non-isomorphic interpretation than if we only had the sentence, every horse didn't jump over the fence. This is a facilitation even for adults, and they were trying to find out if this is a facilitation for children. And they had two conditions where one was a negation after an affirmative and one was a negation without an affirmative. So one was just, I think, every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence, and one was just every horse didn't jump over the fence. And the results were that, again, adults are very gullible, they accept everything, and the affirmative actually facilitated the acceptance of non-isomorphic interpretations for children. So before, or in the isomorphic, in the first group where they didn't have an affirmative, it was 15% acceptance. And in the test group where they had an affirmative before, it was 60% acceptance. So that's quite a big difference. And in conclusion, we can say that the contextual factors play a role in the processing. To what extent is quite, like, this is a small test group, so there you cannot really make that assumption, but there is a facilitation. And the last question that Lidz Musolino asked themselves was the developmental question: how do children finally converge into adulthood? And yeah, there is not really a satisfying answer to that, and I think there will be other experiments on that. What we can say is that according to the data from the experiments, 4-year-olds accept non-isomorphic interpretations only 33% of the time, and adults do 93% of the time, and 5-year-olds do 79% of the time. So there is sort of like a growth that we can see. But yeah, probably by age, like by age 6, they would even have like more acceptance. But the interesting thing is that this only concerns numerally quantified objects and not universal quantifiers. So universal quantifiers are still kind of hard for children to process, and we don't yet know why those two things are so different. Or at least I don't know. I don't know if you have an answer to that, but that's all as far as the paper goes. Yeah, and that's it for me.
Great. So just let me clarify one thing. So the context where they did this experiment was exactly the same context as the original experiment, right? So you had you remember the picture where 2 horses managed to jump over the fence, but one didn't manage, right?
Yeah.
So and then in the original experiment, the children would always say true, right? Or false? Wait.
False.
False.
They,
of course.
yeah.
False. Because they would do like no horse, like they would have the no horse interpretation. But then when you give them this contextual facilitation, right? Say every horse jumped over the log, but every horse didn't jump over the fence. Then by magic, at least 5-year-olds, they sort of behave more adult-like, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I guess we can continue and then maybe have a little bit of a discussion later. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
unless anyone has any question, right?
Yeah. Does anyone have a question?
So please don't let me be the only one bothering and annoying the speakers. Does anyone have anything to ask about these things, details of the experiments, issues, concepts, curiosities, anything? Otherwise, we can go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so who's sharing the screen right now? Is it Noki?
It's still me, yeah.
Okay, so I can share my screen now, so I can click through the presentation while you speak. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, that would be great.
All right.
How do I do this? Here. Right?
Yes, perfect. Okay, I will share my screen now. PowerPoint. Okay. How do we do this? Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so just give me a second. So now that Yule has discussed the isomorphism effect, I will start the topic on whether or not indefinites are quantifiable or not. And we are going to start why indefinites wouldn't be quantifiers. There are two representations that say that they aren't quantifiers. It starts with the quantificational variability and the free variable analysis. And if you look at the sentence, a psychologist blank ignores syntactic theory. You can in the sentence A, you can put in usually, which then would suggest that most psychologists ignore syntactic theory. And if you put in rarely, it means a few psychologists. So the indefinite a psychologist does not introduce any of their own quantificational force, but it takes it from other elements in the sentence, in this case, from adverbs. And the fact that there's no force of their own, no quantificational force, that would suggest that they aren't really quantifiers in that sense. Yeah, so instead of treating indefinites as quantifiers, it would make more sense to treat them as free variables, which are bound by other elements in the sentence. Furthermore, if you look at sentence C, the absence of other quantificational elements results in indefinites being bound by an existential quantifier, yeah, which happens, I think, under the default operation of existential closure. So it just says that so if you leave it out, there's either one psychologist or generally psychologists ignore syntactic theory. The other aspect that like the other thing, the thing that gives it another representation is island free scope behavior of indefinites. And yeah, so the quantificational noun phrases can take scope only within a single clause, and indefinites can take unbounded scope, even appearing to take scope out of syntactic islands. And the latter would also suggest that indefinites are non-quantificational. Then I would need the next slide, please. Yeah, so and now we're going to discuss why indefinites would be treated as quantifiers. So the central question in this paper is if they are quantifiers or not. And I've already mentioned some facts that suggest that they aren't. But there are also some facts that suggest that they are, that indefinites are quantifiers, especially if you look at children's grammar, because in child language, indefinites must be treated as quantifiers. And yeah, this brings us to wide scope indefinites. And the problem with indefinites concerns their scope, as if indefinites have a quantificational representation in addition to the representation as variables, then it should have the same scopal options as other quantifiers. However, this expectation is not met. You can see it in the sentence 11, every professor rewarded every student who read a book I reviewed. So there are two main readings. The paper also introduces a third reading, which we will not get to because it's not being discussed in the paper, so I will not discuss it in the presentation really. But in the sentence in A, the NP can be interpreted inside the scope of both universal quantifiers. And in the sentence B, there was a quantifier raising, so there's a non-surface scope reading. Yeah, Reinhardt and Katsos proposed the following solution, that indefinites should be interpreted as choice functions instead of quantifiers in such cases. And a choice function maps directly to an individual member rather than mapping to a singleton set. And it basically means that it picks out an individual so we can get a specific reading. of an indefinite without making reference to syntactic scope. Yeah, so this means that they would be treated at the same way as expressions like adjectives, for example. Like we can contrast choice functions with a superlative function. Let's take oldest as an example. There's only one oldest of some kind of thing. So that, yeah. Then on the next slide, we discuss how many representations there are for indefinites, and so we've for now concluded that there are at least 3 representations. The quantificational variability of indefinites leads to 2 possible semantic representations. They can either be free variables that get their existential interpretation from a default operation of existential closure, or they can be quantificational. And the wide scope behavior of indefinites leads to a theory whereby these NPs can be assigned a 3rd representation under which they introduce the choice function, like discussed before. And the choice functions are bound by root level existential closures operations over those choice functions. And yeah, so there are plenty of representations for one type of NP, but how many are there, I guess, in total? And can any of those be eliminated? For example, is quantificational representation dispensable due to the set of readings that it generates, which can be accounted for under the choice function analysis? So the quantificational representation treats the indefinite like any other restricted quantification. And the question in the paper was also, does this reading may only be derived from use of choice function? Does the existence of choice function representation maybe like eliminate the need for quantificational representation? And yeah, that's why it's so important to consider child language, because when you try to eliminate quantificational representation of indefinites, it is rather inadequate when considering children's interpretation of indefinites. Yeah. And Jarko will continue with 2 experiments, which will show you some limitations and difficulties of children regarding non-quantificational representations involving existential closure.
Okay, thanks a lot. Before moving on, can we talk a little bit about this, because I think we introduced a lot of concepts, right? And we should discuss them a little bit. If you can go back to the previous slide, right? So yeah, so what they're saying here, right, is that so we were assuming that indefinites like a book, right, are translated into existential quantifiers with their own quantificational force, right? But then they say, yeah, but like, wait a minute, we know that sometimes, or there is a way to interpret indefinites where they actually don't have their own quantificational force, right? So one example of this is what is called like the specific reading. So if by a book you mean a particular book that I have in mind, right? For instance, a book that I had reviewed, a specific book, right? Then that indefinite behaves a little bit like a definite. So basically it refers to a specific entity of one single salient book. And there, it doesn't really depend where you put in the scope configuration of the sentence, right? Because it doesn't have its own quantificational force. So it will always be a specific book that we are referring to, right? So in that example, in that use of the indefinite, it basically it does not undergo these different scope interpretations, because it doesn't have it is not translated into a real existential quantifier, right? Am I right?
Yes, I would assume so.
This is like, yeah, this could be the issue about the specific interpretation of the indefinite. And then they talk they discuss this idea about I think that goes to Reinhard works, right? Of, I think also Winter talked about this, about using a choice function, right? So like, what is, can you explain a little bit to me what a choice function is? Or, you know, in very general terms, what's the difference between the usual way we intended indefinites as introducing their own quantificational force compared to this choice function idea? And I guess if we struggle with this, we can also ask Mike for some help, because I think he is the theoretical semanticist here, and he knows a lot about this, right? But just if you want to try to have your first stab, Noki, go for it.
Well, the way I understood choice function is that like you have a function and it, like you get a set of members, I guess, or a set of things, and then the choice function will pick one specific member of that set, like one individual member, and yeah, so based on that, because it picks out an individual, we can I guess get the specific meaning or reading behind it of the indefinite that it refers to, without having to reference the whole syntactical scope.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. I think it makes a lot of sense. Right. So so another difference, right, between the use of a choice function and the run-of-the-mill use of the indefinite as an existential quantifier is that, in a way, if you have a choice function, the domain of quantification is sort of provided by some operation, and then the way you interpret the indefinite is by applying this choice function and by saying, okay, now I'm going to pick up one specific element of this domain, right? Whereas in the standard existential quantifier interpretation, it is the it is the indefinite itself to introduce its quantificational domain, basically via the use of the indefinite. So, you know, for trying to make this in a concrete example, right? If you say every professor rewarded every student who read a book I had reviewed, in the standard interpretation, a book that I had reviewed is like, there exists an X such that X is a book that I had reviewed, right? So if it's 1, it's fine. If it's 2, it's still fine, because a group of 2 books satisfies the definition of the existential, right? And if it's like 10, it is also fine. But if we use a choice function, then we need to have a domain of books, right, that I had reviewed, and then the choice function is going to pick up one specific book out of this domain. So my question is, like, how is the domain of quantification provided if we have a choice function, right? I think that would be the one of the critical differences. Mike, am I saying things that are reasonable? Or
yeah, you sound reasonable to me.
Okay. Do you have any idea about where the quantificational domain comes from if we use a choice function?
Like, so this is not really my area of expertise, but I think, like, maybe it's easier to think in terms of discourse representation theory, right? Where you just say, you separate the introduction of a referent from the meaning of the indefinite, right? I think that's easier to visualize than going deep into choice functions.
Mm-hmm. So in the case of a choice function, basically the quantificational domain would be provided by the discourse or something like this, or by the shared knowledge between the speaker. So it's something that is sort of presupposed or something that is supposed to be automatically provided. Is that right?
You can just, like, if you have the wide scope reading of the indefinite, right? You can also just say, like, it behaves sort of referential, even though it's an indefinite.
Yeah.
Right? You know the book that we're talking about.
Right.
This is essentially what the choice function tries to give you in terms of semantic theory. But I think it's just easier to say, hey, when we have a wide scope reading of the indefinite, it behaves more like a referential expression. So like the book.
Right. So, but yeah, so I guess one of the interesting points in this respect is that you can have this effect of indefinites behaving in a referential way, like as definites, basically, even without assuming that you need a scope function, right? You can just say, this is a specific reading of the indefinite, right? And then, I mean, you must have your semantics work out this interpretation somehow, but you're not necessarily bound to adopt the scope function algorithm, right? The important thing about the scope function is that it allows you to, the choice function, it allows you to have a choice, right? So if you're contextually provided a domain of quantification is, let's say, 5 books that I have reviewed, right? So you still have a quantification domain with a sort of a set of plural entities or a group of books. Then the choice function would still allow you to pick one specific of these 5 books and refer to that specific book, and makes the existential behave like a referential entity, and therefore you can have this sort of narrow scope effect, even if you had the indefinite in a wide scope position, right? Is that true?
That sounds okay, right?
Right. So yeah. So I mean, these tasks are kind of complex, and maybe Zarko is going to tell us something more about this. Mm-hmm. But the whole idea is that, so they are introducing a new level of complexity by saying that, look, there is an additional complexity. That is, it is not the case that every time that you hear a book, you interpret it as a run-of-the-mill existential quantifier with its own quantificational force. Sometimes you can interpret it as a definite, like that book that we all know we're talking about, right? And that book that I had reviewed. And even if we have a quantificational domain of more than one book, a book could still behave as a specific interpretation, could still bear a specific interpretation if we use this choice function trick that allow us to pick one specific book out of a set of salient books, and that will still behave as definite, right? Okay, great. Should we?
Yeah, I think it's best if we go on, maybe.
Yes.
It will all make sense later, maybe.
Awesome. Great.
Okay, so
no, I mean, my question is,
central question.
Do we want to take a break now? Do we want to take a break, or we can go on? Is it okay if we finish this?
Yeah, it's just 10 more minutes or so.
Great. Okay.
Right. So the central question when talking about indefinites here is, what's the best way to represent them? Are they treated best as choice functions, or are they treated best as quantifiers or something else? Okay, that's the central question here. And so Lidz and Musolino did 2 experiments. Right. So I'm sorry, you're not able to see my presentation anymore, or are you?
I'm seeing first experiment slide.
Okay, right. So in this paper, Musolino and Lidz write about two experiments that they did on the quantificational status of indefinites. In the first one, they tried to find out how children interpret ambiguous sentences involving numerally quantified subject and P and negation. For example, take a look at the sentence right here. 2 butterflies didn't go to the city. 2 butterflies, that's the numerally quantified subject and P. This sentence has 2 possible interpretations. Just like we already observed in other cases in experiments discussed in earlier lectures, namely one where the indefinite 2 butterflies, just as we saw in other experiments that we did in earlier lectures, there are 2 readings, namely one where the indefinite 2 butterflies take scope over the negation. So that's a wide scope interpretation, which we expect children to access or to prefer. This reading would be interpreted as there are 2 butterflies that did not go to the city. And there is the other one, the narrow scope interpretation. The negation takes scope over the indefinite. The interpretation would be, it is not true that 2 butterflies went to the city. We expect children to have difficulty accessing this interpretation, right? Okay, so in this experiment, in the first experiment, the participants were 40 children in total. 20 of them were English speaking and 20 of them spoke Kannada. That's a language that's spoken in southern India, as Julia pointed out already. The procedure is very similar to the other experiments that we had discussed earlier. The participants were simply asked to perform a truth-value judgment task based on short stories or plays acted out by the experimenters in front of them. A puppet would give statements and the kids would tell whether the statement is true or not. Okay, so the statements are either true in wide scope and false in inverse scope, or they are false in wide scope and true in narrow scope. So based on the children's answers, we can tell which interpretation they are accessing. And the results that we had after this experiment, they were just as we expected. Children seemingly prefer the wide scope interpretation, just the way to do in sentences involving quantifiers and negation. This leads us to ask if children treat indefinites as quantifiers, and here it seems as if they do. Okay, so treating indefinites as quantifiers would make sense here. Okay, now to the second experiment. Here, Kannada comes in handy again. Why? Well, Kannada is a very agglutinative language, so grammatical and syntactical features are expressed by adding suffixes to words. So Kannada does not necessarily require adding a suffix to mark an accusative case, but it is optional for inanimate nouns. So here, for example, we have 2 sentences, one containing the accusative suffix and the other not containing it. Okay, so here's the one without and here's the one with. The one sentence that doesn't contain the suffix can be interpreted in 2 ways. Either the object takes scope over negation, or the negation takes scope over the object, which leads to either a wide or a narrow scope reading. With the suffix, with the accusative ending, only one reading is possible, namely the wide scope reading, where the object takes scope over the negation. So, as we know, the isomorphism effect shows us that children have a preference for surface scope interpretation. And since by adding the accusative, only the surface scope or wide scope interpretation is possible, we would assume the children could access those. So we would assume that they would understand the sentence with the accusative ending as wide scope, right? Right. So additionally, Lidz argues that the adding, but Lidz argues that the adding of an accusative ending denotes a choice function instead of a quantificational representation of the indefinite. The evidence for this is the fact that whereas the object NP without a suffix allows two interpretations, just like a quantifier would, the object NP with a suffix only allows one interpretation, namely wide scope, which does not correspond with how a quantifier works. Anyways, now to the experiment. So they had 24 English-speaking children and 24 Kannada-speaking children again. The procedure was the same as in the other experiments discussed before, so truth value judgment task. And what was the result? To our surprise, children were not able to assign wide scope reading, okay? Even with case markings. So why would that happen? This basically goes against everything we've heard before. Up until now, they seemingly preferred wide scope reading, so why this wouldn't make sense. So as I said before, Lidz argued that this time the indefinite behaves like a choice function and not like a quantifier. So we can take this fact as a proof for the hypothesis that children treat indefinites as quantifiers. They can only access the interpretation where that is true. When an indefinite is a choice function, they're unable to interpret sentences. Okay. So what are the conclusions? By observing children's limitations in regard to the interpretation of first of all, quantificational and negated sentences, namely them only accessing the isomorphic interpretation in those cases, in addition to observing their preference for interpreting indefinites, in the experiments discussed here, we can conclude that indefinites have a quantificational representation. Okay. We also found out in the second experiment that children sometimes don't access wide scope or the isomorphic interpretation, even in cases where that is the only possible interpretation. So, such as when the accusative ending is added to direct objects in Kannada. That is because in those cases, indefinites do not have quantificational representation, but rather behave like choice functions. Lidz Musolino also raised the question of what could be the possible reason for this behavior. The reason can't be a grammatical deficiency, because children are able to access the mechanisms that are required by the quantificational expressions. So they can use quantifier raising, for example, in unambiguous sentences without negation. Here, children apply these mechanisms just like adults do, as Julia pointed out before in her presentation. So the reason for their preference for surface scope might be the fact that they simply have difficulty revising parses. This is supported by several facts. By using discourse factors, it is possible to alleviate the isomorphism effect in children, as well as induce it in adults, which suggests that the reason is extragrammatical. Secondly, children also garden path more easily than adults, meaning that once they have access to an interpretation, it is simply very hard for them to reinterpret the sentence in another way. Just the way the sentence, the horse raced past the barn fell, can also be very hard for second language speakers to interpret. These facts all lead to the conclusion that the isomorphism effect is based upon the way in which children parse sentences, and not a grammatical deficiency. Okay, so that will be it. I hope it all made sense. Yeah, are there any questions?
I would like to add that, yeah, in conclusion of the paper that I presented, exactly what Jarko said. So children just have difficulty in revising parses, and there is not a grammatical inability to process. But yeah, children just have sort of different ways of processing.
All right, thanks so much. It was really, really good to the three of you, okay? I am very puzzled, but it's not your fault. It's, it's the author's fault. So I guess we can discuss a little bit.
I have to say, like, in the paper, they introduced a lot of things, and we tried our best to really simplify this and break this down into the main components. Yeah, it was just very hard to wrap your head around everything.
I know. It was also, you know, the Kannada paper is also quite hard. So yeah, you did an amazing job also considering that. And yeah, I guess there are a few things that I'd like to talk to you, also to ask you what you think about this, but maybe let's take a short break, okay? And yeah, let's be back in like 5-7 minutes, okay?
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Right. So thanks again. So the first thing that I would like to discuss with all of you is like, so you know, what do you think about these studies? Do you have any critique, any doubt, any question, any dissatisfaction, any? Given also what we discussed together, right? Yeah. So I guess there are two issues here, right? That are definitely worth discussing a little bit. So, so first of all, one thing that you know leaves me a little bit puzzled is that in these works, Musolino and Lidz basically treat numerals and the existential quantifier as if they are the same creatures, right? As if they're exactly the same thing. Now, we haven't really talked about numerals in our course, right? But it's kind of, you know, it's kind of self-evident that numerals and existential quantifiers are different guys, right? And also they sort of they can behave in a different way. Now, there's definitely one issue that they seem to have in common, right? That they can be interpreted specifically or with a non-specific reading. So if you interpret numerals specifically, then they must have an exact interpretation, right? If you're saying you know, two students are gonna talk to me this afternoon, right? Under a specific reading, you are referring to a set of exactly two students who are sort of you know, salient in the conversation, who know who they are, I know who they are, and they're exactly those two students I'm talking about. Say Yasu and Mai, okay? And you can have the same effect with indefinite. So you can say, a student is gonna talk to me today, right? And under one interpretation, a student means that student, that particular student that we have in mind, right? Now there is another interpretation, which is in a way something in between. So then, you know, the purely existential interpretation would be a student is going to come to talk to me means that at least one student, right? I don't know how many. I don't know which one it is. But, you know, I have a lot of students and I'm quite sure at least one of them is going to talk to me, right? Now you can have a similar effect with numerals as well. And, but then things are a little bit more complicated. So I guess one of the reason why Reinhard picked choice function is that a choice function allow you to range across different elements of the domain by keeping the numerosity constant. So if you assume that two students are interpreted with an exact reading, so if I say two students are going to come to talk to me, even if I'm not sure who those two students are, they must be of numerosity, of cardinality 2, right? Then the choice functions allow you to use, basically to interpret 2 as in a non-specific way, meaning that you don't know exactly who those two students are, but whatever choice of two students you're going to make, you're still going to keep the numerosity of this group of students amounting to 2, right? But then you can have a third kind of interpretation, which is non-specific and it's not exact. So then this is the closest thing to an indefinite predication. So you say something like, two students are going to talk to me today, and maybe even more, right? So in this case, not only you're not sure about who these two students are, but you're not even sure whether they are 2 or more. Because logically speaking, if the interpretation of numerals is unbounded, it is compatible with larger numerosities, right? And you, again, yes, please.
So just very generally, why, apart from this paper, why would it matter? So why would we have to classify numerals? How is that different than just a bare plural indefinite? Like, how is two students are, I don't know, going to school different from students are going to school?
Right. So now you're introducing another problem, which is that bare indefinites have a specific interpretation. So for instance, generic interpretations, right? If you say students go to school, students go to school on Mondays, right? Okay. The generic reading of students, basically. So it's a little bit like in the example that you mentioned, I think in the first presentation, that you have a sort of a covert adverb saying like, usually students go to school on Mondays or something like this. Now, the problem with the generic interpretation is that it really sounds like a universal. Okay. So if you're saying students go to school on Monday, you are sort of saying something like, all, the usual set of standard students, all of them, they do this, right? I mean, I'm allowing for some exceptions. Of course, the lazy students probably are not going to do that. The students who are on holiday are not going to do that. But in general, or the standard prototypical set of students, all of them, they're going to do that. So that's another problem, right? So when you have indefinites, so if there is one very, very true thing, that a very important problem that was raised by the study, is that indefinites are actually ambiguous at different levels. So not only at the levels of their scope, but also the level of their very interpretation, right? And then there are a lot of different ideas in semantics on how to account for this ambiguity. And in particular, they tend to assume that you can resolve the problem of specificity versus, let's call it, bare existentiality, or existential quantification, basically behaving like an existential quantifier with your own existential force. They sort of assume that you can resolve this problem just by adopting the choice function, right? So that you say, okay, I have my choice, I have my ambiguity, and then I can say, okay, you have an indefinite, and then first thing you want to do is to decide whether you want to you want to interpret it as a pure indefinite, as a real existential quantifier with its own quantificational force, or as a choice function. And if you do that as a choice function, then you're going to get a specific reading. And this, this is not so clear, especially in semantics theory. So first of all, there are other ways to derive the specific reading of indefinite, right? For instance, Mike mentioned like discourse representation theory, and the idea that sometimes indefinite can refer to variables and not to have their own quantificational force. You say, I don't know, a student walked into the park and he fell, right? And he hurt his leg. Now, this a student doesn't mean that there is a student in the world that walked into the park and blah, blah, blah. It's rather, I'm introducing a new discourse entity, which is specific, which is definite, basically. I'm talking about that guy, that particular guy, and then the indefinite is going to refer via variable to that particular guy that I introduced in the discourse, okay? So I'm not sure if I guess you can sort of work this out with the choice function, but I'm not sure that it is assumed to be always the thing that you're doing, right? Just one specific way to model the interpretation of indefinites, right? So, Yasu, are you following what I'm saying?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything to tell us about this? So Musolino and Lidz were assuming that basically when you have a specific interpretation of an indefinite in sentences like every student read a book that I reviewed or something like this, right? They were assuming that when you have an indefinite, if you interpret it with a choice function, it's not going to have its own quantificational force, and you can and then you can have a specific reading of the indefinite, basically. So is this like the standard way to account for the
standard? I don't know, because I think there are many different views about this. Right. This is certainly one of the views.
Right.
Some people say choice functions are always referential, so you don't quantify over choice functions, but you have to find a choice function in the context. Right. And there are also other ways of getting the same interpretation without choice functions. Actually, choice functions are known to have problems in certain configurations. So there are millions of different views about indefinites, and I don't think there's any standard at the moment.
Right. So yeah, so I guess that's what I was trying to say, that it's so the take-home message or the important part of these experiments is not really the alternation between pure existential force or choice function, right? It's more like the specific non-specific alternation of readings, right? And then you get this sort of intermediate reading, which would be something like a non-specific reading if you have numerals, right? But still that would, where the numerosity of the group would still be exact. So if you're saying like two students are gonna talk to me today, but I don't know who exactly they are, right? You are not using two as a pure existential quantifier, because that would be like that the numerosity of this set is at least two, right? But you're saying, okay, the numerosity of this set is exactly two, and then I have let's say a salient set of students in mind of 5 students, but then with the choice function I can choose two a subset of exactly 2 students ranging over this contextually provided set of 5 students, right? But then you can do it also with other things. you can also have a sort of an existential quantifier, or a sort of an adjectival meaning for this set of students. So something like, there is a set of students, and this set of students has cardinality 2, and still you can play you can play with the scope of your quantifiers and have that this existential quantification with exact numerosity ranges through a certain domain that is actually contextually provided. Am I saying crazy things, or this makes sense? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So yeah. So there are these different issues, but yeah, it's definitely, it's a common property of numerals and indefinites that if they get this specific reading, then it doesn't really matter what is their position in the scope, right? Because if you interpret an indefinite as a definite description, like a boy as that particular boy, whether it's high in the structure or whether it has the lowest position, given that it does not have its own quantificational force, it's not gonna have effect for the interpretation of the whole sentence, right? Is this clear? This is, I think, the most important point of these kind of experiments, and it's also a big problem for all these considerations about scope and the effect of these elements. So I don't know, Yulia, Noki, and Zarko, what do you think about this? Do you have any comments?
It's really hard to grasp. So
yeah, I know they're very, 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 these are very, very complex topics, right? But it's nice, like in the way you showed it, right? It's nice that you highlighted the main point of these experiments, that was, let's take a language where the surface order does not match the deep structure, the order of the deep structure, and let's see if children care more about the linear order in which the quantifiers appear in the sentence, or in the structural order in which they're actually interpreting the deep structure, right? And the conclusion of these guys was like, yeah, it's actually an issue about the real grammatical structure. It's an issue about the C-command relationship and not really the surface order, right? Now, the problem is that in certain languages, these two things correlate. So it's often the case that when you change things in the linear order, then you also have the effects in the deep structure. I guess we should go to the next presentation soon, but there was one more thing that I wanted to say. There was one thing. So I would like to sort of relate this stuff about our discussion about the scope economy constraints, right? Because Lidz Musolino don't talk about this at all. Probably Fox had yet to publish his book, Fox Economy Constraints. So probably he did already, but they didn't, I don't know. So I think that book is from 2000. When was this paper? When was this paper published? The one on Kannada?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think 2006.
Yeah, 2005 to 2006.
Right. So Fox dissertation Fox Scope Economy was published in 2000. Yes, do you remember that? Or Mike, anyone?
Yes,
anyway.
It's 2000. The book is 2000.
Right.
It's his dissertation from 98, actually.
Right. So they should have known, and they should have mentioned that, right? Because if we, I mean, this is getting a little bit tricky, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's just a sort of, like food for thought. And then we're going to talk about that later, okay? So the idea is that when you have a universal quantifier, a negation, right? you have this pattern that we discussed. So if the universal quantifier is in subject position and your negation is downstream in a narrower position, right? Then you can have inverse scope. So every student didn't make the assignment, right? So I'm using D to try to avoid the problem of the scope of another indefinite. Every student didn't eat the cake. Can have two interpretations. So that one where no students ate the cake, and the other one where you invert the scope, and then you have that not every student ate the cake, right? But if you remember, in the Fox economy and also the Mayer and Spector paper, they said, look, the reason why when you have a universal quantifier in object position and it has a narrower overt scope with respect to negation, right? So you have not every. You cannot have inverse scope, because if you have inverse scope, you are going to have a stronger interpretation, and you don't want to have that. So you want your scope shift operation to give you a weaker interpretation, or in the original Fox terminology, or in the model, in fact, a semantically different interpretation, right? So again, if you have not every and you switch the order of not every, you get every not, which is universal negation, which is super strong, and that's not good. But if you have every not, that's already super strong because it's universal negative. And then if you switch the order of every and not, you get a weaker interpretation, which actually can become semantically independent if you compute an implicature on that. So every not but some, and that's fine. Now, $1 million question, right, is what happens when you have an indefinite? So we haven't talked about that. So it's, or maybe we did mention that, right? We definitely haven't talked about numerals. So my question is, what happens when you have an indefinite? And what happens when you have numerals? Okay. Now, we are going to talk about that again. But do you have any thought? What happens if you have, for instance, an indefinite and negation, like in your examples? How's the scope configuration with respect to the meaning of the surface scope and inverse scope? So your sentence was I don't know, a student didn't do the assignment.
With numerals, like two students?
Two students didn't do the assignment. Let's do it with indefinite first, right? So a student didn't do the assignment, right? What does it mean in like pseudo formal terms? There exists at least a student who didn't do the assignment, right?
Yeah.
Could be more, could be two, could be three, could be four. There is at least one who didn't do it, right? Now, what happens if you switch the scope of negation?
It's a universal quantifier, not a student. Like none.
Right. So it's the universal negative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is stronger, right? Because universal negative is the strongest. So that means that if you do the inverse scope, when you have an indefinite in subject position, you get something stronger, right? And is that okay or not? It's bad. According to
it should be equal or weaker, right?
Right. So when you have an indefinite in subject position, you're not supposed to do inverse scope if you interpret it as an indefinite, right? But you can do that when it's in object position, right? Because then again, let's say I didn't eat a cake, right? I didn't eat a cake, not a cake, not existential, super strong. And then you can, if you do inverse scope, you actually get a weaker meaning, and that's fine, right? So how would that be in this example? I didn't eat a cake. What would be the weaker inverse scope interpretation?
That there is a cake that you didn't eat.
Right. Now you see that this interpretation still is ambiguous, right? And it's quite clear why it is ambiguous. Because you can say, oh, look, there is that cake on the table, right? And I didn't eat it. Or you can say, there is at least a cake that I didn't eat, right? Which is compatible with basically, there are a lot of cakes on the table. Let's say, we had a party, we had some cakes, and someone is telling me, Daniele, you ate all the cake. Are you crazy? You're gonna feel bad. And I'm like, no, look, there are still cakes on the table, right? I didn't eat a cake. It's kind of strange like this, right? Doesn't really, at least that doesn't really sound natural to me. But the idea is that if you scope out the indefinite, that you can say, okay, there is at least a cake that I didn't eat, and it can be more than one. Whereas if you have the specific interpretation, that makes everything easier, because then you're saying, okay, I'm talking about that specific cake, right? And I didn't eat it. And it doesn't matter whether it's like in a narrow scope position or if it's in a surface scope position, because if it's interpreted as a definite, the scope configuration is not going to matter, because it will always stay as definite. It does not have its own quantificational force, and it doesn't matter when you put it in the structure. And then you can see that, right, by saying, okay, that cake I didn't eat, or I didn't eat that cake, right? Kind of means the same. Or yeah. So, okay, food for thought for the next classes. Now, again, when you take numerals into account, things are even more complex, because numerals are also ambiguous between their exact and non-exact interpretation. So potentially, when you have numerals, you can have specific and non-specific interpretation. You can have an exact and non-exact interpretation. And you can have, for instance, a non-exact interpretation ranging over a contextual provided domain via a choice function. So these are a lot of degrees of freedom, but there is one constraint in what I'm saying with respect to specific and exactness, with both numerals and indefinite. Can you tell me what that is? So the question is, if you have a specific interpretation, do you have any commitment about whether the set you're talking about is exact or not?
So are you asking if I have a specific item in mind and I refer to it with an indefinite, whether it makes sense to do that? Or
no, I'm asking if, I mean, it's a very stupid question, but I ask it in order to sort of highlight this problem, or this fact. So if you're using a specific interpretation, yeah, do you make any commitment about the numerosity of the specific set of entities you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, if you use a singular, I would say then you have one, right?
Right. And what about numerals?
Yes, you make
Yes. Yes, right? So it's something very important to bear in mind is that, okay, we have these multiple dimensions of ambiguity, right? But if you have a specific interpretation, then you automatically have an exact interpretation as well. And if it's about indefinites, then it's a unique, right? So it's not just that you know exactly the numerosity of your set, but you are also assuming that it's a one. It's the set composed by one element. Okay. And you know, if you have commitments about the numerosity, it also entails that you have commitment about the logical properties, so the logical strength of that, right? Because in general, something that is unique is logically stronger than anything that is not unique, basically, right? Or it's logically stronger than something that is that has a larger cardinality in a non-negative context. So if you're saying very trivially, I met a boy by conveying the information that we know exactly who I'm talking about, right? That also entails the weaker existential meaning. So that there is a boy that I met, right? Okay, so more food for thought. I will move to Aziz.
Yeah, okay.
If you are ready, awesome.
Yeah.
And right, so you're going to tell us something about
Pragmatic tolerance.
Yeah. So now we are shifting topic a little bit. Now we're going to talk about implicators.
Quite a bit.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, please.
So at first I just wanted to say that I have a little bit more. Well, I have 10 slides actually, but I can skip some slides if you want.
Well, I mean, just go on until you want. So we started like 5 minutes later, so I guess we can go a little bit over, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay. Do you all see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my topic or my paper was from Katsos and Bishop, which is pragmatic tolerance, the implications for the acquisition of informativeness and implicature. The last lecture we surfaced the part of informativeness, which I will explain you a little bit about later. So the introduction. The two main purposes of this paper was to demonstrate that the ability to generate quantity implicatures relies upon competence with informativeness. And also, this competence with informativeness is also necessary for detecting ambiguity in referential communication tests. Later, I will give you an example about referential communication tests. The other purpose they had in this paper was to challenge the conclusion that children younger than 7 years old lack adult-like competence in their tasks. So the theory. Most of the investigations of acquisition of scalar implicature reported that children younger than 7 years of age cannot derive implicatures at adult-like levels. So as I mentioned, the referential communication tests, which were sometimes used. Those referential communication tasks were like the experimenter shows the participants a picture of two men and both of the men were wearing a hat. And then they asked the participant point at the man with the hat. What children do under the age of 7 is that they point to a reference, so they don't object that the experimenter hasn't given enough information to choose between. They just pick one, so they accept that. The other thing they mentioned in their paper is that most existing studies have exclusively considered scalar implicatures, and the question here is whether to generalize the findings to non-scalar implicatures. Therefore, I will explain you a little bit about the scalar implicatures and the non-scalar implicatures. The main difference between those two implicatures are that scalar implicatures, which we have heard about, which are like some and all, or might or must or and, are just informational scales which are available without reference to a specific context. So you can say some, and you always know that there could be an all as well. In the meantime, the non-scalar implicatures are something like we had the question like, did you dance with Bill and John? And then the answer could be, I danced with John. That is a single noun phrase. And therefore, you have to know that there is at least a Bill and a John, that you can implicate that the stronger term would be Bill and John. So as it's said here, the more informative alternative proposition can only be established with reference to context. So you have to know the context. So I also wanted to talk about a little bit of the binary judgment task. And there we typically have just answers like true, false, right, or wrong. Just that, as judgment for less than optimally informative statements. So there we have, if participants base their response only on what is explicitly said, they should accept the answer. If participants interpret the answer with a scalar implicature, they should reject the answer. So therefore we have, if participants reject utterances with a weak scalar term, which is like some and not all, in the situations where a strong term is applicable, they do not do so because they have derived an implicature. They can say, yeah, you could say some, but all would be more accurate here. And here comes Katsos. And Katsos was arguing that participants do not need to calculate the implicature to object the utterances. Therefore, they were talking more about like children, because children, as I mentioned before, mostly are not able to detect, he could have said that, but they can still negate the stronger implicature. So it is therefore not clear whether binary judgment tasks test participant sensitivity to informativeness, so if they're sensitive that there is something more, or their actual derivation of implicatures. So therefore I will come to the first experiment of Katsos and Bishop. And the method was this. They showed a scene to the participants, and there's always an experimenter who was explaining the scene. Then the experimenter asks a question to a figure which was called Mr. Caveman. And the experimenter always tells that Mr. Caveman wanted to learn perfect English. So he wants to get help from the participants if he was saying was right or wrong. So therefore they see the scene, then the experimenter asks the question to Mr. Caveman, then Mr. Caveman gives the response, and then the experimenter asks the participants if that answer from Mr. Caveman was right or wrong. They did that with scalar and non-scalar implicatures, with scalar expressions and non-scalar expressions. So here as an example, the example they talked about the most, the first was, here you can see the scene, or like what was going on here. Then here is the scene, and the scene is more important. The mouse picked up all the carrots, where there is a pile of pumpkins and carrots. And then the experimenter asks Mr. Caveman, so what did the mouse pick up? And then Mr. Caveman answers, the mouse picked up some of the carrots. And that is an under-informative statement or utterance. In the next one, in the non-scalar expressions, like the example I gave before, quite similar, we have a dog, and the dog is an artist. He likes painting things. And there you can see, or they can see, a square, a star, a triangle, and a heart. The scene they were then watching is that the dog painted the heart and the triangle, so just two of them. Then the experimenter asks Mr. Caveman, so what did the dog paint? And the Mr. Caveman answers, the dog painted the triangle. So he again just gave an underinformative utterance. So here Mr. Caveman gives a logically true but pragmatically underinformative response. They also had more utterances or more statements or scenes, and all of the remaining stories were just to test whether participants could accept the optimal conditions, optimal utterances, which are both logically true and pragmatically informative. That would be something like here, the dog painted the triangle and the heart. Those would be the optimal condition or utterance.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Aziz, thank you. Can you go back to the slide? Yeah. So I think I mentioned that last time. So you might be not very confident with this terminology, right? So what is underinformative, right? So an underinformative statement is another way to define a pragmatic violation, right? So a statement in which if you derive the implicature, then it's gonna be false, basically, right? And likewise, we can define the notion of informativity as logical strength, right? So there's a little bit of confusion in the literature, and many people do not believe or do not understand this equation, but logically speaking, informativity is logical strength, right? And then you can mention one term or the other, or we can also discuss about that. But the idea is that, and then maybe we're going to talk about that for the non-scalar implicatures, right? But the idea is that it's kind of the same mechanism. In fact, if you use an only, you can force the implicature in both cases. So you can say the mouse only pick up some of the carrots, meaning some but not all, and the dog only painted a triangle, meaning he didn't also paint the heart, right? So you see there is a nice parallel between these cases. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's true.
Just want to say this. Thank you.
Okay. So they were scoring the responses in a way that children responses were straightforward, yes, no, right, wrong. And they were just scored as correct or incorrect. But with the adults, it was a little bit different, because normally in the other experiments which they mentioned, most of them were just scoring also with the binary system, so just right, wrong. And therefore the adult participants weren't able to give indirect answers to them. So here, the straightforward response is like yes or right to underinformative utterances, which is like they accept that this is true, were scored as incorrect because the participant did not object the infelicity. So here he doesn't mention, or normally they got responses like yes, but he also picked all of them, not just some, like in the case of the mouse. So the mouse, if he says he picked up some of the carrots, some participants, or well, the adults normally said things like, yes, he also picked up all of them. So they have given indirect ones. So the result for the children was that children rejected underinformative utterances at rates of only 29%. That justifies the conclusion that many children lack some aspect of pragmatic competence. So they just accept most of the underinformative utterances. So the analysis of indirect responses. We are going now back to the adults. Many adult responses, as I mentioned before, did not consist of a straightforward acceptance or rejection, but were more like indirect, as I mentioned, like half true or also like yes, but. At 12% at the scalars and at 33% at the non-scalar utterances. So if those indirect responses are scored as incorrect, then adult performance falls to 88% and 67%, which is still outnumbering the children. But because those indirect responses only happened in the underinformative conditions, adults do not consider violations of informativeness to be as grave as violations of logical truth. They still accepted it kind of because it is just like half true or something like that. So discussion on the first experiment was, the first experiment shows that previous experiments with the same binary judgment task show as well. Children lack some aspect of pragmatic tolerance, so that they basically copied the other experiments they were talking about. However, Katsos and Bishop propose an alternative explanation for children's acceptance of underinformative utterance. They say that children are tolerant of pragmatic infelicity in binary judgment tasks, and they therefore developed a ternary judgment task, which is experiment 2. In experiment 2, they used exactly the same items and scenarios as in experiment 1, but instead of answering right or wrong, the participants had to reward Mr. Caveman using a 3-point scale, which were strawberries, which differed in size. They then discussed that the adults instinctively just scored as they would say they would. So they put the huge strawberry for the optimal conditions, so it was the best reward, he was doing right. Then the big one, which was the middle one, for underinformative, because he was kind of but not completely right, and then a small one for false utterances. And then for the children, they put here a table where you can see in the false one, the false utterances, the children also used most of the time the small one. On the optimal, most of the time they used the huge one, which is like exactly the same as the adults. But also, and here's the critical point, at the underinformative part, they also used the big one, like the middle one. That says us, or Katsos and Bishop were concluding from that second study, that children are sensitive to informativeness, but also tolerant to informativeness. So they know that there is something going on, which in binary judgment tasks they can't do. Actually, they have to say yes or no. So the conclusion to that paper is that existing studies of acquisition of implicature do not unambiguously test whether participants are deriving an implicature or simply exhibiting sensitivity to informativeness. The other conclusion is that the acceptance of pragmatically infelicitous utterances need to be attributed to lack of pragmatic competence, but may instead be due to tolerance of pragmatic violations. So they are tolerant toward it, they accept it kind of. There may be no difference in the acquisition of pragmatic competence with scalar and non-scalar expressions. But about this, I haven't talked a lot here in this paper because I have to shorten it. Yeah, so that was my presentation on pragmatic tolerance.
Okay, thanks so much, Aziz. It was very, very clear, very nice. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we're running a little bit out of time, so I guess we don't have a lot of room for discussion, right? But the main point of this paper is that, you know, there were all these experiments in the literature that claim that children could not derive implicatures because they lack the ability of doing that, and they quite nicely showed that actually, if you give them a way to express their to express a sensitivity to under informative sentences, so to express a sensitivity to pragmatic violations, they would actually express it. So they would be sensitive to sentences that are not optimally true, and their trick was to use this intermediate reward, right? So by that they conclude that, look, if you make your task more felicitous, then you're actually going to find that children do derive scalar implicatures. The problem is not really about whether they derive it or not, but how they judge the truth of an underinformative statement, right? And also they introduced this interesting difference between pure scalar implicators and these other kind of implicators that are triggered by different scales, let's say this. And some people call them non-scalar implicature, and you know, we can discuss the topic about whether they're really scalar implicatures or not. But yeah, the main point was very clear, is that, look, we've been wrong all these years in which we thought that children could not derive implicatures, they actually can. So it's not that they lack processing resources for doing that. It's not that they lack a competence for doing that. They can actually do that. They would just judge a pragmatic violation in a different way compared to adults, basically, which is not dependent on the fact that they could not derive the implicator. Okay, cool. So thanks a lot. Thanks to all the presenters. And I guess we can call it a day, right? If you have any questions or about any point to discuss about these experiments, please keep them in mind for the next class, which will be on Wednesday, right?
Yeah, but unfortunately, I can't attend that class. So
I know. But if we discuss about your stuff, we are going to record this, so you
okay,
can,
great.
you can see that later.
Excellent.
And on Wednesday, we are going to have Alina talking about the fleeting isomorphism. So more about this bloody isomorphism that keeps on fleeting. And then Annie talking about the scope of isomorphism. So turning adults into children. So another interesting experiment where, the rationale is quite similar to this study that you presented, right? So now we're going to see some other studies where they say, look, maybe children are actually able to derive inverse scope, just like they're able to derive implicatures. It just was the wrong experiments that we did in the old studies, right? Maybe if we give them some facilitation, they're going to be able to do this fancy thing. And then Joanna is going to talk about the Gualmini paper, very interesting about, again, scope ambiguity in child language. So it's always going to be a topic of whether children are actually able or not to derive this interpretation. All right. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to stay here for a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, have a nice day, and see you on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.